Hello, I wanted to introduce you guys a little bit to some ideas behind rhetoric and argumentation, and how to basically go about forming an argument, developing an argument. Remember, rhetoric is the study of rules and methods of argumentation. It's an analysis of the relationship between someone making an argument, who's the writer, and their audience, who's the reader. And it seeks to find the most effective way of persuading the reader. So rhetoric is all about studying what's going to be most persuasive. There have been a few different rhetorical theories over the years. We're going to learn two with this paper. In the next paper, we'll learn about Rogerian argumentation, which is a different rhetorical method. This time we're going to learn about Aristotelian rhetoric and Toulmin rhetoric. Aristotelian rhetoric developed out of ancient Greece. At the time, it was believed that the purpose of argumentation was to arrive at ultimate truth. There was one true solution to every problem, and that if you argued, truths would be revealed to you. You'd be able to look at different things that you already knew were true and discover new truths. But now we live in an age of moral relativism, which basically means that we believe that there can be more than one correct answer to a question, that what's true for one person might not be true for everyone. And so Stephen Toulmin, who's a British philosopher, came up with this idea called the Toulmin rhetoric system in the late 1950s. He continued to write about it, and it continued to gain popularity throughout the 1980s. And basically what he did is he kind of expands on what Aristotle had already done and builds it into a more contemporary type of argument. Aristotelian rhetoric was developed by Aristotle. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher. He was the student of Plato. He was the teacher of Alexander the Great. He wrote a book called Ars Rhetorica, or The Art of Rhetoric, which was the first book on argumentation, on how to be persuasive. In it, he came up with the idea of having an introduction, body, and conclusion. That's something we still use from Aristotle. He basically laid out different elements that each of those should contain in an argument. In the introduction, he says first you need to grab the reader's attention. He called this the exordium. Then the next thing you need to do is give what he calls the narration, which explains the history of the issue leading up to the current argument. So what have people said before about this? How have people tried to answer the question that you're trying to answer? And then you end with a proposition. A proposition is a thesis statement that proposes a solution to the issue being discussed, or it proposes an answer to the question. I don't want you guys to focus too much on solution, which we're going to look at later in the next paper, but just kind of take a stance on the issue. So should we care about this issue? Yes, we should, or no, we shouldn't. How should we feel about the issue? What's your answer to that sort of question? With the body, you have kind of three things to do. One is confirmation. The confirmation confirms that your proposition is true by providing reasoning and evidence to support it. And remember, in Aristotle, he believed that it was true. If your proposition wasn't true, then you had an invalid argument. In the concession, you give opposing views. Why people would disagree with you. Why people would think another answer was correct. Following that concession, you give a refutation where you argue against the opposing views, exposing their weaknesses and downfalls. In Aristotelian rhetoric, every opposing view is wrong. There can only be one right view, so you would have to go through every single opposing view and argue against it and find arguments against them all. You guys will need to go through and consider opposing views in your essays, but you won't need to argue against them all. In the conclusion, you give an accumulation, which is a summary of what you've said so far, and then a peroration, which is a final emotional appeal, where you try to make the reader feel something. Toulmin kind of looks at it a little differently. He's not as interested in where in the paper things show up, but he's kind of interested in the ideas behind the argumentation. One thing that he developed is what's called the enthymeme. An enthymeme is a claim plus a reason. It's what we often think of as kind of a thesis statement. And the claim The claim is what you want the reader to believe or to do. So in this case, where you're making a position paper, you want the reader to believe something. You want the reader to have the same point of view about the issue that you do. That's your claim. The reasons are why they should have the same point of view. When you add the claim and reason together, you have an enthymeme. And a lot of times that looks kind of like a thesis statement in the claim with a forecasting statement for the reasons. Here's the claim, that's your thesis, and then the different reasons why people should believe you and should accept your claim would form the forecasting statement, or the preview of what your body paragraphs will cover. In the grounds, you have evidence supporting your reason. And so far that should kind of all make sense. You give a reason, you would give evidence to support it, examples to support it. The next part is where it gets a little tricky. That is the warrant. A warrant is an unstated assumption upon which the enthymeme, which is the claim or reason, rests. An example of a warrant is basically something, sometimes the writer might not even be aware of it, but you would need to think about what kind of assumptions you're making in an argument. But a lot of times it's unstated, not because the writer's not necessarily always unaware of it, but simply because it's something that's more based on, that's more argumentative sometimes. And if the reader disagrees with the warrant, the whole argument falls through. I'll give a couple examples of a couple from very controversial issues, just because they're a bit more obvious and it kind of gives a good idea of what a warrant is. With arguments about gay rights, for example, there's people who support gay rights tend to believe in the warrant that homosexuality is inborn, that it's genetic, that it's something someone is born with. People who tend to be against homosexual rights tend to believe as a warrant or assumption that it's a choice. In an issue like abortion, people who tend to be pro-life tend to assume or have a warrant that life begins at conception. People who tend to be pro-choice are more likely to believe that life begins either once the fetus could live outside the mother or is born. So those different warrants, those different beliefs or assumptions about when life begins would definitely shape a person's reasons. And the thing with warrants is, if you come out and state them, you might kind of put your audience off. But your audience might come up with them anyway, so you still want to provide evidence. Why do you think that is? A lot of times these are based on things like values, ethics. You want to think about what's that, find backing. Backing is evidence that would support the warrant. Why do you hold that view? You want to try to provide some evidence for it, even if you don't come out and state the view. So that's the warrant and backing. With conditions of rebuttal are opposing views. There are reasons that people disagree with you. In Aristotle, you have to argue against all of them. Toulmin would say some of them you don't really have an argument against. And therefore, you would have a qualifier. A qualifier is a rewording of the enthymeme to account for conditions of rebuttal. So, for instance, you've got some movie that you think is the greatest movie of all time. And so you say, oh, this is the greatest movie ever. And your friend's like, well, what about this other movie? And you realize that that's their favorite movie, and you can't convince them that your favorite movie is the best movie ever. And so you say, okay, well, it's one of the best movies ever. Changing it from the best ever to one of the best ever would be a qualifier. And what it does is it basically says different people are going to have different opinions on the issue. Different people are going to have different ideas of what makes something correct. And because different people have different opinions, sometimes you have to take that into account and reword your thesis, reword your claim. And what it does is it actually makes the thesis and claim stronger because it makes it so that it's more flexible. If you disagree with everyone and you don't accept any exceptions, then if someone can poke a hole in your argument, then all of a sudden your whole argument falls apart. What a qualifier does is it gives you some wiggle room. and it basically allows you to kind of bend and then bounce back. So it actually makes your argument stronger, even though it makes your wording sound weaker. Aristotle also talks about persuasive appeals in Ars Rhetorica, specifically ethos, pathos, logos, and kairos. I'm going to talk a little bit about those. Ethos is the root of ethics, the word ethics, ethical, and basically what ethos means is the writer trustable? Are they credible? If you're reading something, do you trust the author to be honest with you, to be truthful? A writer gains credibility by illustrating to the reader that he or she is knowledgeable about the topic. That knowledge may come from experience. So if you can discuss firsthand experience, that's something that's useful. Or research. The way to get research is the use of outside sources. Another comment real quick on experience. When you're writing about personal experience, that's a good time to use I. But typically you wouldn't use I if you're just talking about your ideas or your values or your beliefs. If you take I away when you're writing about those things, then they will seem more like factual observations to the reader than just your opinion. And once you take it away from just being your opinion, the reader is more likely to accept it as true. So another thing to do with research is use appositives. When you're introducing a source, you can use an appositive to explain its credibility. An appositive is a phrase offset by commas. The phrase offset by commas there is offset by commas, which means it has a comma before and after it, that renames a subject. For instance, George Washington, father of our country, claims that father of our country would be an appositive. Depending on what topic I'm going with, I might want to call him the first president or premier military commander or America's first general. That would be an example of an appositive. And that tells me why that source is credible, why I should care what they have to say about the topic. A lot of times when you have an author, you can do a little Googling and find out something about them, which boosts their credibility with your reader. Another way to build ethos is through style. One thing you can do is write an active voice. The subject of the sentence should take action and not have action taken towards it. Active voice assigns responsibility to the sentence's subject, and it also makes the writer sound more confident. If you can add by zombies to the end of a sentence and it makes sense, then it is in passive voice. Another good thing to do with style is to proofread. That's why it's important to have good grammar. Well-written prose makes readers respect the writer as being more intelligent, whereas if you have a lot of typos or a lot of sentence fragments, or things that are confusing in your essay, the reader's going to think, maybe this person doesn't really know what they're talking about, or maybe this person didn't really care about doing research if they didn't care about proofreading their paper. That's why it's important to have good grammar, is because readers will judge you for it in the real world, and that's why it's important to have proofread. I'm going to go ahead and take a break here, just because if not, the video will run out, and I will continue this in another video.